All right, let's get right into it. You've heard about the Jeffrey Epstein deal from 2008, right? I mean, it's been a source of so much anger and just questions for years. Well, today, we're going to look at it from a totally different angle. We're going inside the Department of Justice's own investigation of itself, how its own team handled the case.
So where are we getting all this from? Well, our source is the DOJ's own Office of Professional Responsibility. You can just call it OPR. Think of them as the department's internal affairs. They're the ones who make sure the government's lawyers are actually following the rules. So this isn't some pundit or critic talking. This is literally the government grading its own homework.
You might be asking, okay, a deal from 2008. Why are we digging this up now? Well, it's because of something called the Epstein Files Transparency Act. This new law has basically opened the floodgates, forcing a massive release of documents that have been sealed for years. And just like that, this old case is front and center all over again.
And with this flood of new information coming out, we're going to zero in on one document that is just incredibly important. It's that final report from the OPR we just mentioned. Seriously, this is the closest thing we're ever going to get to an official report card on how the DOJ handled that original case down in Florida.
And what's wild is that when you actually look at this report card, the very first thing that jumps out at you is this huge contradiction right at the heart of it all.
Get this. On one hand, the report says that the lead prosecutor, a guy named Alexander Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney at the time, it says he did not commit professional misconduct. Okay. But then on the other hand, in this same document, it says his decision to make the deal was poor judgment. So wait, what? How can both of those be true at the same time?
Well, the whole thing hinges on this super specific legal definition of professional misconduct. For the DOJ to label something as misconduct, a prosecutor has to have intentionally or recklessly broken a rule that was already crystal clear. I mean, it's a really high bar to clear. It's set up that way to let prosecutors make judgment calls. So the investigators basically said, look, we think this deal was a terrible idea, but they couldn't find a specific written-in-stone rule that Acosta actually broke.
And you can see how they felt about it in the language they used. The report itself calls the deal, the non-prosecution agreement, or NPA, a flawed mechanism. I mean, that's their own words. It tells you everything. They're basically saying, okay, maybe it didn't technically meet the super high bar for misconduct, but we're on the record saying this thing was just fundamentally broken and did not deliver justice.
So that begs the question, right? How did this flawed mechanism even happen in the first place? To get that, we've got to rewind and look at the timeline and watch how a really powerful federal case just completely fell apart.
Okay, look at how this plays out. It starts small in 2005 with local police. But by 2006, the feds, the FBI, they're involved because the local guys aren't happy with how things are going. A year later, May 2007, federal prosecutors have a monster 60-count indictment drafted and ready. A slam dunk, right? Well, no, because just 4 months later, poof, it's gone. Replaced by this secret deal that lets Epstein plead to much weaker state charges.
So what was actually in this infamous deal? Let's break it down. Epstein agrees to plead guilty to state charges, serve a pretty short sentence in county jail, and register as a sex offender. In exchange, the government agrees to drop its entire federal investigation. But here's the real kicker, the part that's just mind-boggling, the immunity. It wasn't just for Epstein. It wasn't even just for 4 other named people. No, it was a massive, sweeping immunity grant for any potential co-conspirators. It basically put up a giant stop sign on any further investigation into his whole network. So you have this deal being hammered out between the full power of the U.S. government and Epstein's army of high-priced lawyers. But somebody was missing from the table, weren't they? A huge, glaring omission. The people this was all about, they were left completely out of the loop.
And it's the question that the DOJ's own report keeps coming back to again and again. What about the victims? Where were they in all of this?
The internal report found just a whole cascade of failures here. First, and this is huge, the victims weren't even consulted before the deal was signed. A federal court later said, yep, that violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Then, after the secret deal was a done deal, they sent letters to victims that were, well, misleading, saying the case was still ongoing. And to top it off, Acosta basically passed the buck on notifying victims about the state court hearing, so a lot of them had no idea it was even happening. And the report's final word on this is just devastating. It says, and I'm quoting, that Acosta failed to ensure that victims were treated with forthrightness and dignity. I mean,
Let that sink in. That's a stunning admission of failure coming from the Department of Justice about itself. And that brings us right back to what's happening today. Because all those failures we just talked about, the ones detailed in this report, they didn't just fade away. They ended up planting the seeds for the huge push for transparency that we're seeing right now.
You can actually draw a direct line from the secrecy and the feeling of injustice from that 2008 deal straight to the creation of the Epstein Files Transparency Act. The public outcry, the political pressure, all of it over how that original case was bungled is exactly why these documents are being released now. It's a direct cause and effect.
And this image really captures the two sides of this whole transparency push. On one side, you've got the public Epstein Library. That's the sunlight everyone was demanding. But on the other side, you see a little peek behind the curtain, an ad note box. That's from the internal system where reviewers are making these incredibly difficult, sensitive calls about what to redact to protect victims' privacy. It's the balancing act, right there in front of us.
And really, this all boils down to one final, incredibly important question that we're all left with, as we're all searching for the truth in this. How do you balance the public's right to know everything with the absolute duty to protect the privacy of the victims? The same victims that the government's own report confirms are so badly failed by the system the first time around. It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer.